if there's one function here inside Pixel Creator Pro that I would not want to live without, the guidelines in Pixel Creator Pro would really rank high in my list, because when I'm doing layouts, setting up different guides and different margins is really very important to me, and it's incredibly tedious to do here inside Photoshop. Say for example, I have a layout here that I want to create a 1-inch margin all the way around the outside edge of my layout. You know how complicated that is in Photoshop? It's very complicated. I have to click on View, New Guide, and then I do a vertical guideline at 1 inch, and then View, New Guide, and do a horizontal guideline at 1 inch, and so on and so forth, until I get 1 inch all the way around. What a royal pain. So what we did here in Pixel Creator Pro is we created these guideline tools that work in a million different scenarios. Anything we want to do with guidelines, now we can do in just seconds. So let me show you this. So right now we just have a basic document open, right? So when I click on Guides, we get this giant dialog box with a million options here, but essentially we're going to be adding guidelines based on the document. Notice over here the selection option is grayed out because we don't have a selection. And then we can have a basic, so under here we have a basic margin. So if I did 1 inch, boom, we get guidelines 1 inch around the outside of our document. How cool is that? If I click on guides, and let's say my lab says we need a trim margin of 1/8 of an inch and a safety margin of 3/8 of an inch. Well, first of all, we have to know our decimal places, but if we type in 0.125, comma 0.375 here in the margin field, when I hit process, bam! Look at that. We get 2 sets of guidelines, one at 1/8 and one at 3/8, and now we're ready to design our album layout. So C is for clear. We do have a basic, what I call a basic album layout, which is R for reset. And basically all that does is it assumes we're working on a double page spread, which when you're doing album design, that's what we should be doing. And then it creates a 1/4 inch guideline around the outside perimeter, shows you exactly where dead center of your layout is, and shows you dead center left and right, both vertically and horizontally. And it doesn't matter what our page size is, it'll find all those positionings for you automatically. So let's add to this by making a selection. Now, in certain circumstances, it might be fun to add guidelines based on a selection. So when I click on Guides, notice now the selection option is no longer grayed out. And I can do, like if I want to do a margin of 1/2 inch, notice that the option Keep Selection is still selected. Watch what happens. So we do Process, and notice that the guidelines were created based on the current selection 1/2 inch to the inside. Now watch this. If I hit Guides and did -0.5, now the guidelines are created to 1/2 inch to the outside edge. And if I hit Guides again, let's do -1, comma, -1.25, process. Then you see we get 2 sets of guidelines to the outside of our selection. One at 1 inch, one at 1.25 inches. So when we want to go to the outside of something, we enter it as a negative, or if we want to the inside of something, which is most generally the case, then we just add it as a regular positive. So we'll hit clear. Okay, so that's probably as clear as mud, right? Now let's add a couple of layers. In this case, we're adding a shape layer. And let's add one with the Add Aperture tool. And let's add one with the Add Aperture tool, but no layer mask. And let's go back to this one that does have a layer mask, and let's just resize the image within to be much larger than the layer mask. So you can see by the transformation handles here that this image is much larger than our layer mask, right? We can all agree on that, so let's relink those two together. So this guideline tool is very sophisticated. We've already seen how it adds guidelines based on the document size if that's all we had selected. So in other words, if I have my background layer, even though I have multiple layers here, if I click on guides, it assumes that I want to use the document bounds. In fact, when I'm on my background layer, that's the only option it gives me. But when I'm on a regular layer and I click guides, in this case I'm choosing guides with no layer mask, it says, do I want to add, it no longer says selection, does it? It says based on the mask or the content. And it doesn't matter whether it's a bitmap mask or a vector layer mask, it'll add guidelines based on either. So if I do -0.5 and hit process, we get a set of guidelines to the outside edge, exactly a ½ inch. Let's go ahead and hit clear. So if I click on this one that has a layer mask, click on guides, do the same thing, -0.25. We get a series of guidelines exactly a ½ inch to the outside, but notice it's a ½ inch to the outside of the layer mask, not of the image that is part of that layer mask. Okay, and then lastly on our shape layer, if I click on guides, do the exact same thing, -0.25, ½ inch to the outside edge based on the vector layer mask. Now I'll go back to our document here. We do have an option here where it says gutter. And this is really probably a more advanced function, but let's just go ahead and click on vertical and horizontal. And let's do 0.25. And we hit process, and you can see what's happened here is creates a series of guidelines, what we call a gutter, and it's done it exactly a ½ inch wide right here in the dead center of our spread, as well vertically and horizontally, because we chose both options. That is a more advanced feature. We'll get into more specifics in other videos on really the more practical reason that you would use those, but just kind of keep that in mind. Under detailed here, we do have options to create detailed setups. So like if I wanted a guideline at 2 inches and at 6 inches starting from the left edge, and one guideline from the right 2 inches in, I could hit process, and we get a guideline at 2 inches, at 6 inches, 2 inches in from the right edge as well. Very, very useful stuff. Now, lastly, we could actually do something really crazy here. I've selected all 3 layers here. When I click on guides, when you have more than one layer selected, it says, do I want to add guides to individual layers? In this case, we'll say yes. And here's what I want to do. I want to find the center vertical and horizontal of each of those layers. So when I hit process, boom, I get a guideline that represents the center vertically and horizontally of each of the 3 layers. Pretty cool stuff. Very, very useful stuff when you're doing all kinds of different layouts, not only for albums, but for marketing pieces and other things. Those guideline tools are absolutely invaluable. Now, lastly, we do have the B for border, and that's really all it does. It adds a series of guidelines around the border of our current layer, whether it has a layer mask or does not, B for border, or a vector layer mask, B for border. So every type of scenario it's covered. And also if I make a selection and I choose the B for border, it will add guidelines around the border of my selection. And as we go through some of the more advanced tutorials, you'll see where these different functions really come in handy when we're doing different types of layouts. Likewise, if I select more than one layer and hit B for border, it'll ask me, do I want to add guides to individual layers? I'll say yes, and it adds guidelines around the border of each one of my objects. Okay? So that, in a nutshell, is our guide functions. Again, we'll get into more specifics in the more advanced tutorials on how we utilize these guide tools, but they're really quite invaluable. And like I said, it's probably one of the features I would not want to live without using Pixel Creator Pro.